Good evening, and welcome. My name is Robert Gassman, and I'm a sophomore McConnell Scholar here at the University of Louisville. At this time, I'd like to hand the mic over to Dr. Krebs from the History Department to provide us with a few words about our lecture series tonight.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to keep my remarks short because you don't want to see me up here. You want to see my favorite Canadian speaking up here. I just want to say a few sentences about the series. I did that for those already who were here, what was it, 2 weeks ago. And the idea behind this series, America at the End of War, where we have 3 lectures this fall, is twofold. When I started thinking about it together with Gary Gregg, from the McConnell Center, the idea is, first of all, to talk about warfare as an actor and factor of change in American history. Okay? So just like there's many other actors and factors of change in American history that I'm sure many of you have studied at length, I would like to look at also warfare as a factor and actor of change in American history. So that's one reason. The second reason is, as a military historian, to look a little bit at the end of war. Military historians are very good at studying the outbreak of war, campaigns and battles. We often overlook that the end of war has tremendous importance as well, and what happens after often is much more important than the actual battle or the actual campaign during the war. And so those are 2 main ideas behind that series that we developed for the fall, and I hope you enjoy what we're trying to talk about. It came pretty timely because by the time we were thinking about it, it was late 2014, early 2015. The idea was that, of course, the United States is getting out of another war, so we're getting out of Afghanistan. It turned out to be not the case. Okay? The aftermath to Iraq and Afghanistan turns out to be much more complicated than many of us had probably hoped and wished and anticipated. And so in that sense, it's also a great pleasure to have a number of historians this fall here talking about the aftermath and the end of war and how very complex and complicated these things sometimes get. But with that, I'll leave you guys. I'm going to hand it back over to Robert, and I hope you guys enjoy this talk, and then the next talk that's going to be November 5th on the end of the Vietnam War. Okay, thank you.
We continue the McConnell Center's public lecture series, America at the End of War. For those watching from home, you can participate this evening by tweeting your questions to @ULMCenter. It is my privilege to introduce our lecturer this evening, Dr. William Campbell. Dr. Campbell received his PhD from McMaster University in Canada in 2007. He was the Albert M. Greenfeld Dissertation Fellow at the Library Company of Philadelphia from 2005 to 2006. He has published articles related to early American, Native, and Canadian history in Ontario History, European Journal of American Studies, Pennsylvania History, Canadian Military History, and New York History. He has a chapter in the book, How Fighting Ends, A History of Surrender, and his first book, entitled Speculators in Empire, Iroquois and the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, went to paperback last year. And as an aside, that actually is our book award this evening. Currently, Dr. Campbell researches the interplay between colonial and indigenous representatives during the 18th and 19th centuries. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. William Campbell.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Does that need to be turned off? In particular, I'd like to thank the organizers at the McConnell Center, Gary Gregg in particular for the funding, bringing me here from Memphis, as well as Daniel Krebs, a friend and colleague who extended the invitation, I don't know how long ago, maybe a couple of months ago. In fact, I'll start there. The invitation itself, when Daniel asked me to come here and talk about the end of the War of 1812 and Native Americans. And I said, sure, because somebody was going to give me money to talk to them. Had I known the Blue Jays were playing tonight, I might have reconsidered. But they're being trounced, so this is a better deal. At any rate, when Daniel asked me to do this, I thought, yeah, no problem. I'll talk about Native Americans at the end of the War of 1812. I studied primarily legal history, treaties that are signed between Native Americans and Europeans and Americans, so I thought this is a nice extension to the stuff that I'll be doing. And then I started thinking about it a little more. I'm like, I don't really know a whole lot about what happens in North America directly following the War of 1812, besides the story of removal. It's the beginning of the removal period that actually gets instituted officially in arguably 1830 with Andrew Jackson, and from a period of 1830 to 1838, arguably, or 1840, essentially most of the native populations on territory that was sought after by the United States government east of the Mississippi were removed to west of the Mississippi. And that was going to be it. I thought, okay, I'll just figure out, I'll tell this story. I'll tell this story about removal. And then I thought, that's not my specialty, and I didn't want to bore everybody in this room for 50 minutes on the legalities of policies related to Indian removal. So if you came here today hoping that I'd be talking about the legal documentation surrounding removal and policymakers, I'm sorry. But as you can see, that's actually what I was, initially that's the title suggested. Instead, when I started thinking about the War of 1812 and the end of it, I really started, and this actually relates nicely just by coincidence, to some of the stuff Professor Krebs just mentioned. And that's, you can't think of this war, or the War of 1812, in isolation. It really, as I mentioned to some of Professor Krebs' students just moments ago in a seminar, it really is the culmination of 3 decades of conflict in North America. And whether or not we want to call that American War, or America's War, or North American Wars, it really extends from the end of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, up until the end of 1812. And so if we're going to look at what happens to Native Americans following the War of 1812, we really have to figure out what's going on with Native American populations throughout the duration of, or the end of the 7 Years' War, and into the Revolutionary period, and some of the changing dynamics and paradigms that both shift and define that period. So that's kind of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to kind of step back, talk a little bit about the nature and relationship between natives and both Europeans and then later Americans, with the help of providing a better understanding of why the removal policies went into effect, and as viciously and as quickly as they did following the War of 1812. So let me continue. And if my phone beeps or buzzes, it is because the Jays are scoring runs, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm a little bit jumpy up here. Good. Less than a year before the United States, General William Henry Harrison marched a force of 1,000 strong into Prophetstown, one of the many seedbeds of a militant movement gaining momentum throughout Indian country. The Shawnee warrior Tecumseh, the most famous resident of the soon-to-be besieged town, wrote the future president of the United States. The only way to stop this evil, that is white colonization of Indian lands, is for all the red men to unite in claiming a common and equal right in the land as it was at first and should be now, for it never was divided but belongs to all. Sell a country? Why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for us to use as his children? Tecumseh's rhetorical questions to Harrison underscore 2 important concepts we should keep in mind when we think about native populations, both leading into the War of 1812 and following the War of 1812. First, and perhaps most obvious, is the Shawnee warrior's insinuation that the only way to cure the disease of American colonization, poisoning the lands west of the Appalachians, was through the remedy of armed conflict. Back, into the great water, whose accursed waves brought them to our shores, Tecumseh told his followers in 1811. Burn their dwellings, destroy their stock, slay their wives and children. The red man owns the country, and the pale faces must never enjoy it. War now, war forever, war upon the living. war upon the dead. Dig up the very corpses from the grave. Our country must give no rest to a white man's bones. So Tecumseh's message is fairly clear. And it relates to a pan-Indian or unification movement that really takes hold after the 7 Years' War, which I'll get to in a few minutes. One directed, arguably, at a race as much as it is at the European colonial force. Tecumseh talked about a historic unification, as I just mentioned, of First Peoples that would transcend the disputes of ancient tribal enemies in order to rid Indian lands and minds of all things American. By 1810, the year Harrison opened Tecumseh's letter, the unification the Shawnee warrior alluded to had become much more than talk alone. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Native Americans from the shores of the Great Lakes to the muddy waters of the mouth of the Mississippi prepared for an apocalyptic race war. Harrison, as well as his political contemporaries, knew this well. They too prepared for a genocidal conflict. That's why the U.S. general led 1,000 soldiers into Prophetstown in the pre-dawn hours of a cold day in early November 1811. The resulting Battle of Tippecanoe left the targeted Indians without a village or winter food stores. It left mothers without children and children without parents. While Tecumseh and his warriors were in the south gaining support for their movement, Harrison's men burned Prophetstown to the ground on that cold November day. For Tecumseh and his followers, the destruction of their homes and hearth helped justify their cause. Okay, the other component of Tecumseh's letter to Harrison we should keep in mind is perhaps the most obvious, and that is the stark difference between the worldly views of many First Peoples and many First Peoples and Americans. In a struggle that stretched back to the mosquito-plagued planks of the Chesapeake, ever since Europeans laid claim to North American soil, felled trees, fenced farms, and stripped the land of many of its natural resources, Native Americans have maneuvered to maintain control over their lives and the land on which they lived in. Arguably, the impact of European ideas, private ownership, market-based economies, unrestricted or total war, and aspects of Christianity as well, was as transformative to Indian communities as were old world diseases and technologies. But by the War of 1812, over 2 centuries of exchange, struggle, and redefinition had resulted in a clear and emerging victor in the wars of cultural domination. And for many Native Americans, the individualistic, profit-seeking world of the colonizers was as difficult to accept as would be the selling of the air, the oceans, or the earth beneath their feet. And so when war between the United States and Britain erupted in 1812, for many Native communities, the decision to fight the Americans was one based on 2 peoples no longer able to occupy the same space, as perhaps is best illustrated in Tecumseh's letter and Harrison's destructive response. But this duality, colonized versus colonizer, and its many reiterations over time, civilized versus savage, Christian versus heathen, cowboy versus Indian, freedom lovers versus evildoers, perhaps, was not always the case in early North America. Stories that focus on the clash of white and red, if you will, might make for a tidy bedtime tale, or a Walt Disney movie, or even a John Wayne movie, but it also makes for problematic history. In short, it's too simplistic. It's what Tecumseh's letter doesn't say that adds a third and very important aspect to our understanding of both why Native Americans fought in the War of 1812, and as it relates more specifically to this talk, why what happened after the war marked a significant turning point in the history of First Peoples throughout the territories claimed by the United States. What Tecumseh doesn't mention in his letter to William Henry Harrison is the internal struggle unraveling in Native American communities across North America. Like many revolutionaries, Tecumseh and his militant followers, known as the Red Sticks, offered one, albeit the most physically threatening and most violent, course of action in a long and complex indigenous struggle to maintain independence and sovereignty. There were other paths to follow, and many Indian leaders and communities opted to reject the call to arms. In fact, many Indians sought to protect their homes and their lives through various forms of accommodation. Some openly resisted what Gregory Dowd calls the nativist movement associated with Tecumseh, and even some bore arms alongside Americans during the War of 1812. In the end, like most wars, there's nothing tidy about who was fighting whom during the War of 1812, or what happened after. It was a civil war, to borrow from Alan Taylor, for both Native Americans and Americans. Ironically, however, the impact of the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary era in general on Native American populations was much less complicated. Divided, displaced, and dehumanized, a hatred of First Peoples helped to define an emerging American identity while providing a convenient enemy for a new empire. In the early 1800s, as much as fear fueled indigenous apocalyptic prophets and their weapon-wielding followers from Michigan's Mitten to the deltas of New Orleans, fear too also fueled the aggression of a nation towards an enemy as much constructed as it was real. By the end of the War of 1812, for the general American population, politicians, and policymakers, all Indians became Tecumseh. All Indians became savages. All Indians became obstacles to progress. All Indians threatened the American way of life. All Indians became targets. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition, President Andrew Jackson declared in early December 1833. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their own inferiority or seeking to control them, they must yield to the force of circumstances or forever disappear. Well, Jackson was wrong, but the story I will continue to tell today isn't about Jackson, and is more to do about America at the end of war, or at the end of many wars in the early 19th century, and those people facing West with both optimism and dread. It's a story, a reminder perhaps, about the power of historical perspective, the politics of fear, and a state-sponsored genocide and displacement that was a regrettable means to ending a war. All right, I also didn't mention, and I did mention this to the students earlier, that this is going to be a depressing talk. Unless the Blue Jays start winning. Okay. In order to underscore the significance of changes that took place at the end of the War of 1812, we must revisit the position many First Peoples found themselves in leading up to that conflict. For 2 centuries that preceded the American Revolution, North America was an important battleground for European empires, and few rivalries matched the intensity or longevity of the hostilities between the British and French empires. From King Philip's War to the French and Indian War, much of the 17th century and all of the 18th centuries were punctuated by conflict and defined in part by the finagling and positioning of peoples in anticipation of war or following war. In this atmosphere, Native American communities, especially those in what is today upstate New York and western Pennsylvania, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, the Delaware, carefully maneuvered between competing imperial interests to satisfy their own goals. I don't know how well you can see the map, but it gives you an idea. The map on the top left gives you an idea. Others are pointing from this. Yes. This area in here is what I'm talking about. Mostly with regard to, as you can tell, this is kind of a dead giveaway, but the province of Quebec, so this is after 1774, and what are the 13 colonies. Just the fact that this used to be in the French orbit, let's say, imperial orbit, this being obviously the English imperial orbit, and the Native Americans most directly affected are the ones wedged in between, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. After all, the French needed Native American allies to extract the lucrative fur-bearing animals from the interior of the continent that helped make their king so rich, and also to curb English colonization. The English crown, too, needed indigenous allies for resources, trade, and to act as buffers to the French. They all, of course, wanted Indian lands. So, being actively courted by 2 competing empires, meant that for many First Peoples, an opportunity to weigh their options and to hold out for the best possible deal. And this is exactly what they did. Holding out for the best possible deal with regards to access to European goods, which are integral to maintaining their social customs, as it relates to gift giving, as well as to hunting, and to extending their own power. European goods, in effect, that became, ironically, vital to surviving as an Indian. In order to facilitate these agreements, or reconfirm or shine the chain of friendship, councils or treaties needed to be held. Whether it was an intimate affair with local leaders or a tribe, or a great affair with the Superintendent of Indian Affairs and hundreds, if not thousands, of Native Americans, treaties are the things that guided and solidified both the customs and practices and wants and needs for these two opposing sides, or perhaps allies. They were the mediums of official exchange. And as was often the case, treaties were carefully negotiated and not unilaterally dictated. Perhaps the most, I'm going to get a little bit off topic. This is the house of Sir William Johnson. He was the last British Superintendent of Indian Affairs in North America. It gives you kind of a good, it's obviously an artistic rendition of William Johnson's house and the treaty that he held, but it gives you a good idea of kind of the dynamic of exchange. So, in a shameless plug of my own book, I'm going to go back. I think, where does this need to point to? There we go. So one of the perhaps the best, this is perhaps the best, as best exemplified, that is, by the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. That is, having competing interests, meeting to discuss treaty terms, and having both natives and Europeans leave on their own terms. So the Treaty of Fort Stanwix takes place at Fort Stanwix in 1768. And it takes place primarily between Iroquois negotiators and the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, who represents the British Crown, Sir William Johnson. And at this treaty was the largest treaty in colonial history. There was over 3,000 Native Americans gathered, and they were gathering to essentially cede a huge territory of land. And I'm not entirely sure, but Louisville might have been part of or close to being part of the land cession. No, actually I take that back. So in November 1768, Iroquois negotiators meet with the British Crown in one of these treaties. And the reason I bring this up, as I mentioned before, is to kind of highlight the role and position of Native Americans leading up to the American Revolution. So in exchange for 10,000 pounds of hard currency, which is a staggering amount of money, especially when it was stacked up beside Sir William Johnson, and 20 boatloads of goods, the Iroquois negotiators cede what is today much of western Pennsylvania, parts of western New York, parts of Ohio, and West Virginia. They cede this land to the British Crown. The problem is they don't occupy that land. The Shawnee and Delaware occupy that land. And so when we think about Native populations and Europeans during this time, we have to think about the benefits of them coming together and signing these treaties. Did the Iroquois know what they were doing? Absolutely. Did they know English law well enough to know how to negotiate protection of their own territory in upstate New York, or what becomes upstate New York, by directing colonization to the south? Absolutely. Did the British know that the Iroquois had no real power in this area, or no real power over the much more populous Shawnee and Delaware? Absolutely. But the British government wanted legal documentation, a piece of paper in terms of justifying the land cession. And so essentially, and this is what I mentioned to the students earlier today in the seminar, essentially you have two not opposing sides, but two sides during a treaty, and they both are taking something that's not real and making it real through this process. And so, again, this highlights the Native position, or the extent of Native diplomacy and the position that they are in terms of negotiating with empires leading up to the American Revolution. Part of the 1760s, and I'll go through this quickly because I'm already running out of time. Part of the 1768 treaty was in response to the 1763 Royal Proclamation. For those of you who are not familiar with, or overly familiar with the French and Indian War, when it concludes, France essentially cedes an entire continental empire to the British. The British have no way to maintain that continental empire. It costs money. And a lot of settlers or colonizers, if you will, are going on to Indian territory and creating conflict, which costs money to suppress. And so the British want to address this quickly, and they issue something called the Royal Proclamation. And what that proclamation does is it draws a line down much of North America. On the east side of that line is for colonial settlement, and on the west side of that line is for native territory, or is sovereign native nations territory. The problem is most land speculators, guys like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, most land speculators during this time that have a vested interest in occupying or settling that land can't do so without getting rid of that Royal Proclamation. And so what happens is the Royal Proclamation leads to the willingness of the Six Nations to cede territory to the British Crown because of pressures. And the Six Nations are aware of those pressures and cede land that's not theirs to a willing Crown, who then opens up areas for settlement past the proclamation line. I'm kind of going backwards here. The Royal Proclamation is in response to a much larger problem that the British were facing after 1763, and this is hopefully going to tie in now to a discussion that's a little more relevant to the War of 1812. In 1763, when they signed the Treaty of Paris, the British face a daunting task of administering this massive empire. And what happens is almost immediately, native populations throughout the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley begin to discuss the possibility of a pan-Indian resistance against now only one foe. With the French gone, natives cannot play the French off the British or the British off the French. And so when you have massive waves of colonization coming following the end of a conflict into native territory, you have the beginnings of this pan-Indian resistance. And in 1763, one of the first instances that erupts is something called Pontiac's War, where you have prophets like Nealon, who's a Delaware prophet, calling for unity among native nations that were once enemies to rise up and essentially stop what later becomes American, but at that time British colonization onto their territory. So this begins to change in the 1770s. This dynamic and the power structure associated with natives and the role that they play in terms of guiding empire, if you will, through treaty in North America. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, they have a series of treaties that protect their lands. 1768, the Iroquois protecting their lands. But this really depends on the applicability of having 2 or 3 different actors willing to sit down and have a treaty, as well as the importance of the Native Americans and the development of empire in North America. And by the 1770s, that begins to change. It changes for a number of reasons. First, the land west of the Appalachians is highly coveted. And so once the Royal Proclamation is established, and then later the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix reconfirms essentially the boundaries or guidelines of occupation, many soon-to-be Americans are not happy with this. Because it seems as if they are now fighting, or that seems like their crown is now protecting their enemies, being the Native Americans who they just fought against during the 7 Years' War. Once their enemies are now seemingly, like I mentioned, protected by the crown, Indians increasingly become the antithesis of what it was to be an American colonial, and the greatest obstacle to progress west of the Appalachians. In fact, within years of the 1768 boundary readjustment, reports that colonizers had pressed deep into the Ohio River Valley had made their way east to the colonial capitals. With force, Virginians, Pennsylvanians, and New Yorkers pushed west in search of lands, paying little regard for the native residents of the region, or the boundaries the Crown negotiated in terms of native land versus non-native land. By 1773, stories of conflict and murder on the Kentucky frontier sparked some of the first tales about Daniel Boone, a man who inspired American legend. These conflicts soon erupted into Lord Dunmore's War, and not long thereafter, the American Revolution engulfed the land and its peoples west of the Mississippi River. The American Revolution began to dramatically change this dynamic of Native and European interaction. Natives, like I mentioned before, were increasingly viewed as enemies. Indian lands, as much as notions of liberty, became the focal point for war during the Revolutionary War. Native Americans realized this threat emerging from the rhetoric of the Patriots. After all, the Declaration of Independence itself refers to natives as savages. And when neutrality for Native Americans was no longer an option, most First Peoples opted to essentially hedge their bets with the British. The problem is when the Treaty of Paris was signed, the British lost the American Revolutionary War, or lost to the rebelling colonials, and the British Crown's closest allies were not even mentioned. Left to fend for themselves against an increasingly aggressive new American empire, natives faced a daunting task. Treaties were still used, but a dramatic contrast between old and new world ways of conducting diplomacy in Indian country began to establish itself. "I am a man and a warrior, not a counselor," George Rogers Clark told a gathering of Native Americans along the Wabash River in 1778. "I carry in my right hand war and peace in my left." So the American negotiators following the Revolutionary War didn't follow the same protocol that had for 200 years defined how native populations and Europeans interacted. U.S. negotiators opted to dictate the terms of treaties to all Native Americans as though they were defeated enemies, and focused almost entirely on establishing boundaries and the sale of or demand of land as payment. Increasingly, Native peoples and the areas they resided in were being separated from Americans, and the land that they were on bounded with clearly defined territories. Some examples, just some of the wording. 1784, with Treaty with the Six Nations. "A line shall be drawn beginning at the mouth of a creek about 4 miles east of Niagara, so that the Six Nations shall and do yield to the United States all claims to the country west of the said boundary." 1786, the Choctaw Treaty. "The boundary of the lands hereby allotted to the Choctaw Nation to live and hunt on within the limits of the United States of America is and shall be the following." 1789, a Huron Treaty. "And whereas at the before-mentioned treaty it was agreed between the United States and the said nations that a boundary line should be fixed between the lands of those nations and the territory of the United States." 1795, the Treaty of Greenville, following the Battle of Fallen Timbers. "The general boundary line between the lands of the United States and the lands of the said Indians shall begin at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River," etc., etc. 1805, Chickasaw Treaty. "Whereas the Chickasaw Nation of Indians have agreed and do by here agree to cede to the United States and forever quit claim to a tract of country included within the following bounds." So following the American Revolutionary War, treaties became less of something that was a negotiated ends for not necessarily competing interests, but equals. No more equals, essentially, with Native nations facing dramatic obstacles following the Revolutionary War, and the British unable to, or not choosing to, help indigenous populations. Many nations that had sided with the British during the Revolutionary War now faced a very aggressive American foe. U.S. thirst for land could not be quenched, nor could it be underestimated. And it was clear to Native populations following the unfolding events following the Revolution that this was the case. Jefferson's 1787 Northwest Ordinance lays out the blueprint for national expansion and colonization of Indian lands yet ceded. 1780s, the War Department assumes control over Indian matters. Later, an Indian office is formed, ultimately becoming the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1824. In addition to this, Lewis and Clark's famous expedition following the purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, kind of solidifies this idea that the United States will be expanding onto and into indigenous territory. The objective was clear: acquisition of Indian lands, confinement of the Indians in clearly defined boundaries or reservations, and eventually full-scale removal. Treaties and events led to the increased polarization of indigenous peoples and also fueled resentment. Native peoples were slowly losing their independence and their ways of life. And in response to this, two factions emerged. Chiefs willing to accommodate and sell land to the United States as a strategy for survival, and young warriors and religious leaders like Tecumseh, calling for the end to accommodation through a religious revival and militaristic movement. Our lands are our life and our breath, Creek Chief Holloway King declared in 1787. If we part with them, we part with our blood. In the late 1780s, a confederacy of northwestern tribes begins to reject all treaties signed between sachems and chiefs of an older generation in the newly formed republic. And they refuse to accept American settlement on all lands west of the Ohio River. Huron, Miami, Delaware, Shawnee, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Wabash River tribes form and unify into essentially a force that, up until that time, both European nations and Americans have never witnessed. In fact, in 1791, Miami War Chief Little Turtle leads a force of united Indians against General Arthur St. Clair and routs the American force. Over 900 casualties and 600 dead at a time when the young republic was just emerging. Warriors inspired by religious leaders mutilated corpses, slaughtered livestock, and struck fear into the soul of the newly emerging United States. You'll often see reports, and it's used in propaganda in the world of 1812, and I'll get to that in a second, and very quickly, with regard to native abuses of corpses and dead bodies. The reasoning was not only from an indigenous perspective to strike fear into the Americans, but also as an expression of rejecting all things that were American. So domesticated animals, for instance, were often slaughtered by indigenous populations as a result of this. And bodies mutilated and cannibalized. And this had a dramatic impact on solidifying not only a fear of Native populations in the Americas, but also a hatred of Native Americans. Congress responded to these early successes of pan-Indianism by raising a force under General Anthony Wayne and struck back against those same indigenous forces, resulting in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Tensions mounted not only between Indians and Americans, but among First Nations and between Britain and the United States. Conflict between the British and the Americans provided the catalyst, essentially, for competing Native strategies on how best to handle a situation. For Americans, it didn't matter if some natives fought alongside them or tried to remain neutral. They all became scalpers, the savages of the British Crown, the dark faces that lurked beyond the clearing. The War of 1812 and the War of 1812's propaganda fueled this image. Newspapers and pamphleteers print gruesome tales, like I mentioned before, of murdered babies and mothers, desecrated graves and slaughtered livestock. And so when war erupts between the United States and Great Britain in 1812, the Native American militant struggles for independence merged with the war. I can't emphasize that enough. It's something that I mentioned today in a seminar as well. It's not so much that there's not so much that Native Americans joined the War of 1812. It's that it became a vehicle in which they could try to defend themselves and armed resistance and use it for their own sense of armed resistance. The British became the allies of the militant armed resistors, as much as those natives became the allies of the British against the Americans. During the outbreak of the War of 1812, Thomas Jefferson declared, "The acquisition of Canada will be a mere matter of marching." The prediction by the American founding father and the third president seemed sensible at that time. The British were tied down in Europe fighting Napoleon. They had fewer than 1,000, for instance, regular soldiers defending Canada. and the volunteer Canadian militias in the colonies were no substitute for professional troops. Vital to the defense of British North America were the allied Native Americans. In fact, First People warriors played crucial roles in victories at Mackinac, Detroit, and Queenston Heights. Their support saved Upper Canada from defeat and occupation during the first year of the war. Native leaders were fighting to protect their homelands, not British settlements. In exchange for their support, the British promised Native tribes they would get their old boundaries back and their hunting grounds if the war was successful. As allies, though, the British had not proven to be a good bet. And when the British and American diplomats signed the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, once again, Native Americans were left out of the violence. I kind of skipped over this for the sake of time, but this is a good image from a newspaper during the War of 1812. I'm not sure if you can read this, but it says, "Bring me the scalps, and the king, your master, will reward you." This was circulated widely throughout the United States. Another image, this is from 1803, I forget it's the death of, it's not Jenny McCrae, but it might be close to that. But again, this idea that Native Americans are kind of the arm of the British Crown, and they would be killing the women and children of good Americans. All of this propaganda helped really fuse together a collected sense of Indian hating throughout the time. Okay, I'll try to wrap this up very quickly so we have some time for questions. In the years that followed, the American people and government turned against Native tribes, especially those that played a role alongside the British during the Revolutionary War as well as the War of 1812. With the conclusion of the War of 1812, thousands of American colonizers pointed their wagons west towards the Ohio River Valley and Northwest Territory and beyond. Ohio was the first state to be carved out of this new territory in 1803. In 1816, it was Indiana's turn, followed by Illinois in 1818, Michigan 1837, Wisconsin 1848, Minnesota 1858. The entire area covers a total of almost 300,000 square miles of land that formerly was the home to many different Indian tribes that struggled and resisted American expansion. In fact, in the decades that followed the War of 1812, the United States negotiated more than 200 treaties with Indian nations that involved ceding of 99 of those, involved ceding land. 99 of those resulted in the creation of reservations west of the Mississippi River. The policies of this new American empire were typified in 1830 when Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act. And this map gives you an idea, following the 1830s, of how many nations were actually geographically, where nations were removed from the east to the west. And for the sake of time, I'll just say this with regards to Indian removal. Indian removal became, once again, a tool of the U.S. government to remove natives. No longer would treaties be negotiated, they would be dictated. The problem is, once again, the United States wanted to have an air of legality, just like any colonizing force essentially wants to have. And so they wanted to have somebody to cede and wanted to have somebody to cede land. And they found willing participants. They found willing participants in native communities from the Great Lakes all the way down to the Mississippi, particularly willing participants in the Cherokee Nation. And they found these willing participants or chiefs to sign away this territory voluntarily, because at the same time, following the War of 1812, this is when Pan-Indianism collapses. So the divisions within those societies, the young warriors seeking a military resolution to conflict and expansion, their efforts fail. Militarily, they do not drive Americans back into the great ocean. No matter how many Americans they kill, they can never kill enough. And they are essentially outnumbered and outmaneuvered by a much more massive American empire. And so the division within Native communities allows, once again, for essentially the land cessions to take place. Those old chiefs and sachems, or older generations of chiefs and sachems, seeking to accommodate as a form of resistance or survival, sign away thousands and thousands of square miles of territory. I'll stop there just because it's quarter to 7. I just cut short my whole Indian removal stuff, but hopefully I can answer some of your questions with some more detail with regard to that if there's any out there. And I'm not sure how the Blue Jays are doing, but hopefully better than me. All right. Any questions? Yes?
Do you think there's any historical lesson between the Indian removal and the current removal of undocumented citizens?
Oh wow, that's so. Any questions that are not loaded? Undocumented citizens. Well, displacement and removal is a key focal point, obviously, with regards to how the United States responds to indigenous populations following 1812. Oh, I really have to. I mean, yes, I do. I think that there are some relationships in terms of identity, defining who is and who is not American. So, one of the primary Jackson does this. Everybody from Jefferson onwards does this in terms of the United States government, or at least policymakers. They help define and justify removal of Native Americans onto territory west of the Mississippi for their own good, and because they're not identified as American citizens. They don't have the rights of American citizens because Native Americans are, how ironic is that, are not considered to be Americans. So at least legally, that's one justification for removal. The other has to do with a sense of the paternalism, in the sense of for their own good. I'm not sure. I haven't followed U.S. political debates recently on who might be saying that, although I suspect Donald Trump is probably saying something strange. So who knows? Yeah.
What is the difficulty between distinguishing from indigenous people and people who come from another country? Here, I'm not sure I see that as a problem, but apparently you do. You want to describe that?
Sorry, could you, I didn't catch the entire...
What is your problem with distinguishing between indigenous people and those who come from another country? I didn't see that as a problem, but you think that's a problem?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Do you mean in terms of my?
Well, I
my
couldn't
thought?
understand your answer to the previous question.
Oh no, I was just mentioning that any relationship that might exist, and I'm spitballing here because I wasn't expecting a question like that. Any relationship that might exist between events, for instance, in the beginning of the 1800s and undocumented citizens now in removal, the idea of identity. So this citizenship, for instance, is a key factor in the justification of removing Native Americans because they're not considered to be citizens. And so I thought that might be a crossover between justifications perhaps for the displacement or push behind removal of individuals today not to be considered Americans in terms of citizenship. Does that help clarify?
I guess.
Yeah.
Do you think that if Tecumseh hadn't tried to unify the Indian nations, that the War of 1812 would not have happened, or maybe would have happened 10 years later? Did that kind of escalate everything?
Another good question. The War of 1812, the conflict between Great Britain and the United States, that had its own set of problems that was arguably pointing towards eventual conflict, armed conflict. Tecumseh and his followers, not only Tecumseh, but those natives willing to take a much more militaristic and militant stance. I can't emphasize this enough. The messages that are being relayed at the end of the 1780s and into the 1790s, the messages being relayed to the American population is that Native Americans are amassing forces to murder everyone. Like a racial genocidal conflict. And to the credit of, that's why we'll relate to the idea of a politics of fear that's played upon by politicians to help build support to actually go and attack natives and then later used to justify the removal. But that's a key component. So does that help lead to the War of 1812? It helps merges multiple conflicts into a much larger one that includes Native Americans. That conflict was already building in and of itself, and because of the dynamics of trying to maintain allies or have allies, the Native American population that's more militant ends up aligning itself with the British to fight the Americans. I don't think it sped up the war, the outbreak of the war, but I think it made it a much more complicated war. It made it a civil war.
I always perceived the War of 1812 as Britain's attempt, one more time, to get America.
Oh, absolutely.
But listening to you, I'm thinking it was much more complicated than that. It was the British jumped on the bandwagon and united with the Indians once again as another attempt, but then that also
Yeah, so after the
forces going on here.
After the Revolutionary War, British they leave the military posts occupied. They're occupied throughout the Great Lakes. They're occupied by British soldiers. You know, so in all this territory that was essentially ceded to the United States following the Revolutionary War, Britain still maintains control. Much of what you would consider today the southern Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley. They maintain control of that area because they have indigenous allies. So the United States is not able to essentially penetrate into those areas, and the British know this, and they want to maintain positions there because of trade, because of money, because that trade with the population then goes out to St. Lawrence and through Montreal, and the British reap the benefits. The British also don't think that the United States, and for good reason, don't think that the United States is going to be able to sustain itself, the new republic. Everybody at that time thinks, including, say, all of New England, think that there's a high possibility that the republic is going to crash and falter. And so the British are absolutely waiting for that to happen. On the other side of things, though, Americans, when they're entering the War of 1812, think that they could literally just go march a few thousand soldiers north and Canada will fall because there's so few people. And so I think there's misconceptions on both sides as to, another way to put this too is when I was taught about the War of 1812, we won. When everybody here is taught about it and I teach it at my university, I'm like, who won the War of 1812? You know, everybody says the United States won. Well, no one won the War of 1812. In fact, the only person who lost, or the only people who lost during the War of 1812 were the native populations. Because once that boundary is defined between the United States and Canada, once British recognizes, like it's not until 1812 that the United States is really recognized by Great Britain that it will stay there. Then natives become redundant. British don't need them anymore because there's that conflict in order to gain control over that territory or collapse the republic or retake the republic. It becomes a moot point. And so native populations are essentially left to fend for themselves. And the U.S. and the policymakers in the U.S. are far more aggressive towards the acquisition of native territory. And arguably, this is the other component, arguably for good reason do they hold a much more hostile attitude towards native populations, because for the last 30 years, those native populations had opted to side with the British. Yeah.
So we talked about this a little bit in my Race in the U.S. class, and I just wanted to kind of hear your take on it. Do you think that you can see like remnants of these sentiments in the way the federal government interacts with Indian reservations today?
As mentioned, as touched upon in the seminar that I was just at, the way the United States acts towards indigenous populations today, I think is as complicated as how native nations respond to the U.S. government. I think that, with regard to race relations, the dynamic between, I guess, any kind of federal authority or colonizing authority and an oppressed people, that's really, ultimately, that's the historical context, right? So it's an oppressed people that are displaced, targeted, and survive. And so the dynamic between that colonizing force, whether it's a form of a federal government or a dominant race, for instance, dominant in terms of physical or threatening race, I think that plays a key role in how people or societies or communities interact. I think it takes and will take a very, very long time to just begin to help repair some of the negative consequences of everything from forced removal to genocidal war. It really was. Yeah.
Why do you believe that the United States had a change from seeing the natives as savages and as, almost murderers into this fraternal attitude of seeing them, as Jackson called them, as children of America.
Right.
And the change from extinction policy to a removal policy.
Well, it's again, an excellent question. So following the War of 1812, there's also a major push by missionaries, missionizing forces. And when native populations become less of a military threat to the United States, and when they don't have allies like Britain or France, then you see this shift. I mean, the shift is not only because of just the military component, but also a shift in society in general. When you have these are the first waves of missionaries or missionizing, civilizing efforts, I should say, led by missionaries into native communities. So the paternalism that I at least alluded to or I'm talking about now is also reflective of a paternalism that you see in society or throughout American society up definitely by the 1850s, where you have kind of these, I don't want to say self-help groups, but I'm going to, I just did, kind of these this paternalistic self-helping, like, so the natives will disappear or be assimilated. Let's protect them if we can. They become the noble savage. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the literature on this, but this is kind of when the noble savage takes hold of the literary trends in the United States. So the savage turns into the noble savage. So you have a concerted effort to protect, if you will, natives through forced assimilation. So not only do you have removal, and one thing I didn't get into today, this is also the time period after the War of 1812 and into the 1820s and 30s and 40s of residential school, the beginning of residential school systems.
At this time, we have time for one more question.
Is that me?
Yes.
All right.
As long as it doesn't have to deal with anything with.
No.
Okay.
Actually, it's pretty simple. Quick two questions. What was the Native American population in about mid-1700s and beginning of 1900? And the second question is, as this massive relocation and as our westward movement took place in this country, did these not, like the tribes like the Cherokee and the Chickasaw, did they not tell like the Plains Indian about what's coming? Did they try to unite or try to put up any type of resistance?
Right. Okay. So to answer the first question, I don't know exactly, but I can give you some kind of context. Native population declines by 90% from the time of contact. So I think most scholars will usually pinpoint it at the time of the turn of the century, the 18th and 19th century. So it's the early 1800s. Population has declined by 90%. So 9 of 10 people are non-existent. So the best. I'm trying to do some basic math in my head right now. It's not working out so well, but the averages for native population ranges, or the best estimates range anywhere from, I think it's something like 2 million to 20 million north of the Rio Grande. So not many is the answer. Not many in terms of the native populations west of the Mississippi. The populations have been decimated by disease and by war. 2 centuries of disease and war. So removal, while there are still thousands of Native Americans, their numbers are a fraction of what they were. And that also plays a huge role in kind of how the societies are dramatically impacted. All of their social systems, their belief systems, they become much more susceptible to much more militaristic and nativistic movements, for instance, or much more susceptible, on the other hand, to adoption of Christianity or different religions, like their societies are crumbling. To answer the second part of that question, this was also touched upon in this seminar. Many of those indigenous populations west of the Mississippi, they've felt the impact of European colonization, but they haven't felt the waves of settlement. So when displaced and refugee natives come essentially into territory that's, the territory that they end up actually occupying isn't at the heart of any major, and I say this with respect to concepts of empire, any major indigenous empire in the West. Like the Comanches had an empire. And it's not like the displaced Seneca or Cherokee or Chickasaw or Choctaw are placed in the middle of the Comanche Empire. They're placed in territories that are basically not occupied. And their interaction with those other indigenous nations is, there's not the same pan-Indianism that emerges from the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, because in those areas, the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley, that area witnessed essentially death, disease, and destruction in terms of war for over the course of about 60 years, like repetitively. If you go 7 Years' War, Revolutionary War, and then the War of 1812, what unified those warriors that followed people like Tecumseh is a result of that displacement and upheaval. And that does not, there's nothing that, there's no equivalent to that west of the Mississippi. Hopefully that helped answer. Questions? Oh, I guess I'm not allowed to answer.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Campbell.
Thank you.
If you wouldn't mind, would you help me do the book drawing tonight?
Sure.
All right.
How do I just take this?
I mixed them up already. So
Okay. Hannah O'Daniel.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Please come back and see us next month when we're doing America at the End of War, Vietnam. At this time, all teachers, scholars, please meet in the seminar room upstairs.
You're welcome.